super activated evening in the land of the living. Welcome back to my channel. If this is your first time coming to my channel, thanks a ton for stopping by. And if it's not your first time, I'm glad you came back around. And tonight, what we're going to go over is why and how to update your Reason Legacy song files and convert them from the 14:2 mixer into the SSL individual channel strips. So what you're seeing right now is the mixer of a Reason Legacy file. This file has music, it has a sound, so let's go ahead and play it. If you have sensitive ears, this may be a point in time where you want to turn down the music because it's going to be pretty loud, so let's just give it a listen. So, as you may notice, there are multiple sounds in that beat, but there was only one mixer channel that you see on the screen. This is our SSL console. To figure out why there's only one mixing channel, it's gonna require us to go into the rack. Now we're in the rack. At the top of the rack, we have our hardware interface. That's where our audio I/O, more audio, our big meter, and our advanced MIDI sections are. We have our sample input, we have our audio input, we have our audio outputs. Then we have the big meter. That's where we have our VU, our PPM, and our peak. We like to have it set up for the VU and the peak. It gives us a little different information, but it's useful to help us to make sure that our signals are not coming in too hot when we're making the music. Inside of the master section, this is where we have insert effects for the mastering section. Now we have our first channel, which is the only channel that has its own mixing channel in the SSL, because this is a Reason Legacy file. In the original Reason session, if this was 2.5 or if this was 5.0, there would have been no SSL mixer channel console yet. It would have just been the 14:2 mixer. So let's get a better understanding of the 14:2 mixer. The 14:2 mixer has 14 channels, and that signal flow is being processed through the 14:2 mixer. So let's give it another run and listen to it again so we could see the signal flow in action through the 14:2 mixer. So as you can see, all of these different utilities and these instruments, the way that the signal flow was completed in Reason Legacy files, they didn't have their own SSL console channels yet. And that was cool. Like, it sounds great to us. Like, we like how it sounds. We could export this right now and send it off to an artist and have them create a wonderful song to it. But the reason why we would want to convert these files from this legacy file into a more updated version, we're using Reason 11. We know that Reason 13 is out. We aren't upgrading because we're firmly satisfied with Reason 11. It allows us to do everything that we want to do. If you want to upgrade to Reason 13, that is completely fine, and we understand that. There's a great team of engineers and software developers over at Reason Studios and Propellerhead that are making some amazing products, but I'm very satisfied with Reason 11. With that being said, we want to be able to have this NNXT on its own channel in the SSL. We want to be able to have this Kong on its own channel, specifically, like say for like a Kong drum, we have 16 pads for the Kong drum. Say we're using 8 of the sounds of the 16 pads. Right now, all of that signal flow is being processed through the 14:2 on one channel. We may want to have each drum on its own mixing channel. We could achieve that with the SSL. That's what we're going to do. So hopefully that gives you a better understanding. So let's go through from top to bottom from the top, you have your auxiliaries. So you have 4 auxiliary sections. You could send signals into that however you would like to. You have the EQ section that has the treble and the bass, and then you have the mute, solo, the panning, and the fader. So it's fairly straightforward. It has pretty much everything you would possibly want, because say for instance, you could have a compressor going into your first auxiliary. You could have a delay going into your second auxiliary. You could have a reverb going into your third auxiliary, and you could have a transient shaper going into your fourth auxiliary to better shape your sound on that channel, which is perfectly fine. We want to have more control over the signal flow and the dynamics, which is why we would want to convert this from the 14x2 mixer to its own individual SSL channel that we don't get with the 14x2 mixer that has some limitations when compared to the SSL channel. To do that, let's go back to the mixer. Now we're back on the mixer. So you see, we have all of this vacant space here, and we have one mixer channel section. It has an input, it has dynamics, it has EQ, it has inserts, it has send effects, and it has the fader. Those are the 6 sections of the SSL channel. Once you understand the 6 main sections, every other channel becomes more understandable and it's not as intimidating. Now, a physical SSL console can have anywhere from 16 to 32, 64. There's many different channels that it can have. In the digital world, as you see right now, we have one channel strip. We're going to hide these sections and go over each one briefly. We're not going to go into great detail about each section. We may do a video later about that where we demonstrate what the sections do. We just want to cover them so we can kind of get a better understanding of the benefits of using the SSL console over using the Reason Legacy 14x2. It only had 3 sections. That's kind of limited. The first section of the SSL console is the input. In the input, you have your gain. You have a button to where you could invert the phase on or off. You have the signal path, so you could insert it pre, or you could have the dynamics post EQ. When you click on these buttons, you'll notice this screen changes. The insert then goes into the dynamics, then goes into the EQ. We turn that off. If we click the dynamics post EQ, you see the EQ then goes into the dynamics, then goes insert, post and pre. Post means after, pre means it comes before. We could turn that back off. You could filter to a dynamic sidechain. When you do that, that's filtering that signal into a dynamic sidechain, and then it's going into the dynamics, the EQs, and the insert, or however you have it set up. So the second section of the SSL console are the dynamics. The dynamics are your compressor and your gate. There's a benefit of having a compressor and a gate on your mixing channel strip. For instance, you could run a compressor through the auxiliary on the 14x2 and have that signal flow work just the same. Having that compressor on the SSL, it's a benefit to your workflow because you could just dial in some compression right there on the channel itself and not have to then have extra processing and have to use extra DSP to route a different compressor into the auxiliary and have to figure all that signal flow out for that channel specifically. Say you're recording vocals and you have a lot of background noise in your environment. You're not in a traditional studio where you have a treated room. You could then use that gate to adjust some of the extra noise that is coming in through your mic. Now, you could, in the 14x2 mixer, you could then have the signal flow route a gate into your auxiliary and get a similar effect, but then there's just more work that has to be done as opposed of having that gate right on the channel strip, and then you could just dial it in. You could turn the gate on, you could turn the expander mode on or off, you could have a faster attack, and then you could just dial in your range, you could dial in your threshold, you could dial in your release, you could dial in your hold. The third section of the SSL console is the EQ. And on your EQ section, you have your low pass filter, you have your high pass filter, and the way we can get that activated is if we click this button right here, it's going to show us the EQ window. And now you see the EQ window. We turn the low pass filter on right there. We could dial that in. That's good for cutting out some of the higher frequencies that we really don't need when we're mixing. We have the high pass filter that allows us to cut out some of the lows. We could turn the EQ on. We turn the EQ on. That gives us our different bands of the EQ. We have a high frequency bell that basically takes this from a shelf and turns it into a bell. And we have the low frequency bell that again turns that from a shelf and turns that into a bell curve. You would have to route in a parametric EQ that you could see a visual representation, and you don't really have that much sophisticated control on the 14x2 mixer itself. That's one of the benefits of the SSL console, is we get this EQ section that allows us to have the low pass filter and the high pass filter. We could then filter that to a dynamic side chain. So when we click this button here, that activates the button at the top of the input that we went over earlier. Next, we have the high frequency. So this high frequency, this is our gain. This is where we actually dial in the frequency. Then we have our high mid frequency. We also have the gain, and we have the actual frequency that we could dial in. And then we have the Q value, which broadens or narrows the curve of this EQ. Then we have the low mid frequency. Again, we have the gain, we have the kilohertz, and we have the Q. Lastly, we have the low frequencies, and we have the gain, and we have the frequency itself to where we could dial that in. These three are imperative to shaping your sound. The next section and the fourth section of the SSL console. Now the inserts are similar to the auxiliaries. You could insert different utilities and different effects and have them be applied and activated. You would have the rotary to dial it in. Inserts are good for creating different sounds and solving different issues that you may want to use different utilities to enhance or alter your signal flow. The fifth section, the send effects, similar to insert effects, but the send effects, we have 8 of them, and we can activate them. We could have them pre, again, like we said before, pre is happening before, and post is happening afterwards. So we could turn the effect on or off. You have the level that kind of dials again how much of that effect you're going to hear. We have 8 of them. So for an example, you could have a room reverb, you could have a reverb for your drums, you could have a variety of different utilities and effects. So just say for instance you were in a session and in your SSL you're specifically working on your vocals and you want to have insert effects to where you have different devices and effects that you use for your vocals. You could then insert them here and dial them in accordingly. The last section of the SSL console is the fader. Now on the fader section, we have width, then you have your left and right in your pan. Next you have the mute, you have solo, and you have the fader where you can adjust the level in dBs of the sound and the signal flow. Now that was a lot. Hopefully with that explanation gives you a better understanding of the SSL console. You can begin to see some of the benefits of having your sounds going through an SSL console channel as opposed to just going through the 14x2 mixer. Now what we're going to do is we're going to go step by step in converting this legacy file into the SSL console. And to do that, we're going to want to go to browser. Once we go to browser, we're going to want to go to utilities. In utilities, we're going to want to select mix channel, and we're just going to drag this into the rack. Now we have more than 5 sounds. So what we're going to do is we're going to select the mixing channel, and then we're going to press Control D, and that's going to allow us to duplicate these mixing channels. So now if you look on our mixer, we have multiple individual mixing channels. So now what we're going to do is we're going to drag this Kong over under this first mixing channel. We're going to expand it. Now we're going to get into some of Reason's more technical aspects, something that we really like about Reason and how they demonstrate signal flow. So here we are now on the back of the rack. We have our sounds, we have our cables. So now, how do we get the signal flow from the 14x2 mixer into this new mixer channel? So to get that, we take this wire and we add it to the input. We add it to the input. Now this Kong is now going to be inside of this mixing channel. And we see that here. We could speed this up, but we're not going to speed it up because inside of a studio session, there isn't a workaround to just speed up something. So what we like to do is go through the entire process and have you see what is required in that said process. And it's important to see that. So now for this Thor, we identify that the equalizer is the last section of that Thor. So now we go here to number 4, we drag that to the input, and now that Thor is connected to that mixing channel. So we can minimize all of these features. And the next is the combinator. So we'll drag this combinator over here this way, and we'll expand it just so we can see what we're working with. There's a lot going on in this combinator. This equalizer is the last device connected to channel 5. We're going to put that into the input. We're going to put this to the input, turn it around. Now this combinator is connected to this mix channel. We're going to minimize these devices, and our last and final sound is this Kong. And so we're going to expand it, press tab. The Kong is just going into this equalizer. This equalizer is now on channel 6. We're going to take channel 6, we're going to add it to the input, turn it around. Now what we've been able to do is we've been able to converting a Reason legacy file from the 14:2 mixer to the individual mixing channels. This is an opportunity for us to hear what it now sounds like. And we're gonna notice, I want you to look for this. This mixer channel was our initial sound. We don't wanna see any signal going into this mixer. We wanna see all of the signals coming through here. So let's give it a listen. If you have sensitive ears, it may be a time to turn it down because it is gonna be pretty loud. Let's give it a listen. Wonderful. That's exactly what we wanted to happen. We wanted to have our signal flow going into each individual SSL mix channel. Now we think that this streamlines your workflow, again, because if we were just working within the 14:2 mixer, we're limited to the 3 sections. We only have the 4 auxiliary. We have the EQ, which is just treble and bass. We don't have a dynamic EQ. We don't have a spectrum EQ where we have a low pass filter and a high cut filter. Now, some common challenges that you may face, again, when we press tab, you may run into some issues depending on how sophisticated your signal flow is. So for example, let's look at this combinator here. This combinator has 2 6x2 line mixers. So that's 12 different channels. It has 2 RV7000s. It has an NXT. It has an equalizer. It has another NXT, another equalizer, another NXT, a Scream 4, which is a distortion destruction unit, and another EQ. And then that goes into a delay and another equalizer. So a common challenge you may run into is getting mixed up with your signal flow. You can mess up because if you put that wire in a wrong location, then your signal flow is all going to be jacked up. And once you jack up the signal flow, identifying, okay, what needs to go into what to be able to achieve the output, that is a mistake that you could run into. So when you are setting up these devices, and especially when you're getting more complicated, creating your own devices and building your own sounds to tackle different issues and using different tools, you want to make sure that you're keeping up with your signal flow and routing each device and each utility and each effect in a way that allows for the signal flow to be complete. So whatever you're inputting, you get that output. And so a way you could figure out, oh, something is not right, if you know that things are routed together generally how they're supposed to be routed together, but it's just not working, you need to take a moment, take a breath, and then start investigating, moving things around. You start moving too many things around, you could really mess up your signal flow. But that's part of being in the studio. A lot of times, like, we want to get faster results. We want to get to point A to point B faster. But one of the beautiful things of the studio is where we go to make mistakes. The studio isn't where we go to just have everything work. Sometimes you're going to have to figure some things out. And that time that it takes to figure those things out, those are the challenges. But I promise you, the joy and the excitement that you'll have, just like even just routing your first signal flow. So those are some of the challenges to look for specifically with signal flow. Another challenge that you would want to look for is getting overwhelmed by looking at all the things that are on the SSL console. That is a challenge. And the way to get over that challenge is by taking it one section at a time. When you take it one section at a time, you tackle it each individually, and then that can really help alleviate any stress or anxiety that you may have by looking at a console. Like in this instance, we have 8 channel strips. It could be 32, it could be 64, however many it is. Taking it one section at a time and understanding what each section is doing and why it's doing that is a challenge, and overcoming that challenge has great rewards. Hopefully you learned something today that you didn't know yesterday. If you did, that's a wonderful thing. Drop us a comment if you would like us to go over each of the 6 individual sections of the SSL console and what they do. If you made it to this section of the video, much love and respect to you. You could have watched any video on YouTube and you decided to watch mine. So that's real important. I appreciate that deeply. And as always, much love, respect, and peace in